Hello and welcome everyone to Reimagining Cyber. Rob here. And in today's episode, we are heading to the high seas and focusing on maritime cybersecurity. The modern maritime industry is more connected than ever, but with great technology comes great vulnerability. From GPS spoofing to the concerns associated with autonomous ships, the risks on the oceans aren't just physical anymore. Today, we're going to be talking with one of the leading experts in this field. Dr. Gary Kessler is a maritime cybersecurity research and training consultant. He's also the author of Maritime Cybersecurity, a guide for leaders and managers, and co-founder and director of the Maritime Hacking Village. Gary, so excited to have you with us today. Looking forward to our conversation and welcome.
Thanks a lot, Rob. Happy to be here and also looking forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, one of the things I really would like to start with is just getting an understanding from you and your background and kind of the path you took to really this passion, if you will, of yours around maritime security. So why don't you share with the audience, what that really is driven to put so much energy into this area?
So I'm old, so I actually do have a long story here. So I've been engaged in the one way or another in the information security business since the late 1970s. I was in college in the early 70s. My academic background is in mathematics and computer science. I grew up in Southern California, so I've been a lifelong, water person. I've been a scuba diver since the mid-60s and been on the water one way or another, in the 60s and the 70s and all that. I was not a traditional academic. I didn't enter higher education until about 2000 or so. Before that, I worked in industry. I was doing primarily data communications protocols and cybersecurity and things like that. And then, like I said, I was in academia. And quite honestly, I would have to say 7 or 8 years ago, I was realizing that I'm nearing retirement and I'm ready to spend full time driving a scuba boat, and I would have been happy. And then I discovered I was working at an aviation university at the time. They were very happy when they hired me because I had a captain's license, and they were very excited to find out that I had a captain's license. And then they found out, oh, that kind of captain's license. And they were, I'm maritime. I was boat captain. Yeah, they were a lot less excited about it then because they trained pilots. But I was working, doing some stuff related to aviation cyber, and aviation cyber is a mess. But in the process of learning about aviation cyber, I came upon maritime cyber and realized that maritime cyber was really a mess. and it took all of a sudden everything that was my life avocation and vocation, passions, and sort of brought them together. And I got really excited about stuff. So I started working about 7 years ago, doing some research related to AIS. And this is when we were starting to have episodes of AIS spoofing and jamming. And I was looking at the AIS protocols and, reading about many of the protocol vulnerabilities. So I built a little proof of concept about ways in which you could actually mitigate some of the protocol vulnerabilities. And that was a lot of fun. And in the process of that, I had to build a bunch of AIS spoofing tools. So crafting those was a lot of fun. And then more recently, I've been working with some colleagues using AIS and AIS spoofing and jamming as part of open source intelligence to mainly track ghost vessels and dark vessels, most specifically related to transport of Russian sanctioned oil. But the same methods that the Russians are using are being used by a lot of other places as well. So there you have 50 years in 3 minutes.
The audience may, but may not know some of the things you just mentioned, such as AIS. So maybe you can kind of just top level explain.
Oh, sure. Okay, so AIS is the automatic identification system. And, one of the questions people frequently ask about, well, why is maritime cyber different than any other cyber? I mean, secure your systems and you'll be fine, which, at a very, very high level is sort of true. But maritime has many systems that are unique to the maritime environment. And AIS is probably the pinnacle of those systems that you'll obviously only see on ships. So AIS has been around now in terms of regulatory requirements, has been around now for about a quarter century. All big boats need to be using AIS. And what AIS does is it requires the vessels to be sending out relatively frequently information such as their latitude and longitude, their speed, their course, their heading, rate of turn, et cetera, et cetera. And when I say periodically, it does depend upon your speed and whether you're maneuvering or not. But messages are being sent out something like between every 2 and 10 seconds. Smaller vessels might be sending out their messages every 30 seconds.
Hmm.
And every few minutes, the vessel may send out things like, this is the name of my boat, this is the cargo type of boat, things like that.
Hmm.
So it's totally situational awareness, vessel to
Yeah.
vessel, vessel to maritime authorities,
Yeah.
because the messages, at least as designed, even on the big vessels, are only going out 20 to 30 nautical miles, maybe a little bit more, and in crowded places, a little bit less. But for the last 20 years, satellites have been picking up these messages, and it's all going into aggregation databases. So there's an incredible amount of historical information about the movement of ships all over the globe, because this
Hmm.
is an international requirement.
Hmm. Very interesting. I had no idea. So I appreciate. So I was one of those that had no idea what
Yeah.
AI as well.
Okay.
So thank you for that. One other thing that you called out, which I think for me is pretty self-explanatory. I just want to make sure. So you talked about ghost and dark vessels. So to me, it's basically it's under the radar. Is that in essence?
Well, under the radar in the sense that the ghost fleets, the dark fleets, some people call them various vessels, the gray fleet. There are a lot of splitting of hairs there, but a lot of these are vessels that are on the high seas. They are carrying cargo. In many cases, they're carrying illegal or sanctioned cargo.
Yeah.
And the reason they are dark or black or gray, depending, is frequently they do not have legitimate, authentic paperwork.
Hmm.
They are not insured. They are not appropriately inspected.
So let's jump in to some of the cyber specific, maritime cyber specific, I should say, concerns, right? And one of
Sure.
them is definitely centered around, this happens in many different industries, of course, but legacy systems and the modernization, efforts, but
hmm
just dealing with, the cybersecurity concerns relative to those legacy systems. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, so we have a number of things going on there. So obviously, when you say legacy systems, and I'm assuming that I'm going to use it the same way, we're talking about systems that have been around forever, in many cases using outdated operating systems,
Right.
particularly Windows operating systems that might no longer be supported.
Hmm.
Windows XP leaps immediately to mind. Windows XP, by the way, being one of my favorite Windows operating systems. And I say that sincerely. I didn't like them all. And I'm a Mac user. But I mean, Windows XP has not been supported since roughly, vaguely, I think, 2014. And yet there's still XP systems sitting out there.
Sure.
There's still Windows 7 systems sitting out there. And 7, I think, hasn't been supported in at least the last 6 or 7 years. And couple that with the changes that we've been making in the industry, and here, of course, we've got the digitalization of everything going on in the industry, and the efforts to build smart ports, smart ships, smart
Mm.
cargo containers, and all that kind of stuff. And so here, I'd like to throw out the following. All of us are familiar with digitization, which is basically I'm doing things that used to be, let's say, on paper or in analog, and now they're digitized, so I
Hmm.
can easily store them on computers and all that kind of stuff. Now, when I say digitization, here I'm really talking about the base simple things like in 1492, I had a bill of lading. A bill of lading today looks about the same, except today it's a fillable PDF form. And of course, it's stored on a computer and it's transmitted electronically on a network and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
But so the digitalization is not merely converting stuff to digital, it is a whole new way of thinking about an application. So now it says, well, wait a minute. Do I really need to have the captain on the bridge of a ship? Why couldn't I have the captain sitting in an office, not too much unlike my own, having a bunch of displays telling me the status of everything going on the boat, and have a bunch of sensors on the boat? And that's where we start to get the concept of, I mentioned already, the idea of a smart ship and a smart port and things like
Right.
that.
Right.
So you're now the port manager, and you get to sit in your office and you look at a dashboard display and you know every berth in your port you know the water depth, the water speed, the salinity, the temperature, the tide, the current, not to mention what boat is where, what boats are going where. And as the master of the vessel, you also know all that stuff about a port you're going into. By the way, you also know that about every single system on your vessel.
Hmm.
And, I mean, down to literally the tension on a mooring line.
Hmm.
And so I got a little bit ahead of myself by getting into the autonomy, but that's been a drive for the industry also for the last at least 15 years. Again, there's a whole bunch of drivers for why we're thinking about autonomous vessels, but an autonomous vessel obviously does need to have a crew on board. Well,
Yeah.
now
Well,
imagine, yeah.
why don't we jump into that from a
Oh, okay.
cyber perspective, Gary? When you look at the autonomous side of things, right? As
Sure.
you talked about, all these different elements, all this different telemetry available, right?
Yep.
But again, what does that mean? Well, now
Okay.
all these things are connected, and because they're connected, they're vulnerable. So, what are those security concerns that people have to consider?
And that's exactly the issue, is we've got all sorts of regulations that say I need to have somebody on board doing a lookout. Well, I won't have the lookout anymore. I'm going to have a whole bunch of cameras. Well, I will claim that if you have a communications link, it is hackable. I
Yeah,
don't care how many virtual private networks you have and how much
agreed.
end-to-end encryption you have.
Yeah,
There's all sorts of ways where you can hack those things, and that becomes then the cybersecurity issues with autonomy.
right, right. And one of the things that we saw years ago, and I'd like to get your perspective on kind of how this has evolved, is I think it was back in 2017, the whole Maersk cyber issue,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
So talk maybe about like GPS spoofing and the cyber hacking concerns. I mean, that was at this point in time, right? 8 years ago. So much has
Yeah.
evolved, right? So what are some things to consider there?
So two different pieces there. So
Yeah.
let's talk about Maersk. Maersk, as it happens, was not the target of the attack, but they were certainly victimized by the attack. And
Absolutely.
so this was the NotPetya malware that was
Hmm.
floating around. I think it was June of about 2017 or so. And so, I mean, Britain's national health system got whacked as well. They had 80% of their systems went offline. Maersk got hammered because they had systems that were vulnerable.
Yeah.
And it took down pretty much all of their computers. It took down their operations at several ports, not the least of which I believe was the port of LA and Long Beach. But one of the other things that we have a fair amount of resiliency and redundancy in many of our networks. And Maersk, of course, had all the appropriate backups they were supposed to have. The Active Directory servers that were interconnecting and providing the communication pathways within their network.
Hmm.
The redundancy of Active Directory, like in the domain name system in the internet, is the fact that I have a whole bunch of servers. And if one goes down, the others will, populate a new one when it comes up. The
Yeah.
redundancy and resiliency that we don't have is what happens when they all go down at once. And that's what happened to Maersk. They happened to find one in, I believe, Nigeria that the previous day had a power failure. So it was down. Therefore, it didn't get whacked by NotPetya. And they used that one to rebuild. But you also mentioned GPS. Well,
Hmm.
GPS, we have about 35 or 36 satellites in the air at any given point in time. We only need between 24 and 28 for all of us to get all the fixes that we need. So there are some basically backup redundant satellites. But what we are not resilient against is the loss of all of those satellites at once.
Right. Right.
But even without going there, since 2017,
Hmm.
actually, we'd seen demonstrations of GPS spoofing and jamming before that. GPS jamming basically means I send out a signal that is so strong you can't get your GPS signal, so you can't figure out your location.
Mm.
GPS spoofing is when I send you a signal that makes you believe that you are falsely located somewhere other than where you really are. GPS jamming we've seen since the 90s, even when they were designing the system. GPS spoofing demonstrations have been around for at least 12 or 13 years. We didn't see a real case discussed publicly until about 2017 in the Black Sea. And in the aviation industry, they have been also seeing GPS spoofing since around the same amount of time. But GPS spoofing is now rampant, particularly in some parts of the world. The Baltic is a terrible area to fly a plane if you're expecting GPS. Black Sea and Baltic are not great if you're a ship. But GPS spoofing provides a way where I can hide my location or make you think that you're off by a few hundred meters, and maybe you relocate yourself and now get yourself actually in more harm's way than you would otherwise.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think, as you called out, we were discussing the interconnection aspect. There's many benefits of that. But again, we have to think about those cyber ramifications because, again, the connection point is you're connected to the Wild Wild West. And at that point in time, there's many different pathways into it. So the many levels of security, great. You need to do it from a resiliency point of view as well, from cyber and operational. Now, one of the other things I just wanted to kind of call out, there's another aspect of, when you think about Maersk and large ships and containers on the ships transporting goods, high value goods in some cases, and examples of pirates hacking into the systems, right? Logistics systems specifically, and knowing exactly when they're overtaking that vessel, which cargo units, right, they go to, because that's the high value areas that they're basically going to be taking back. And pulling, right? So those are other aspects of all this interconnection point.
Sure. Well, I mean, obviously, as we have more of this stuff digitized and we have more of this in information systems, the integrity of the information that you have is absolutely incredible. And so, again, if I'm the master of a vessel and I'm using all this dashboard information about the state of my ship and the state of the port, I'm believing that the data is correct. To the point you were making, there have been any number of examples of pirates using information about what cargo is in what container on what ship, and by the way, where's the ship? And if I know the container, I know where the container is on the ship. There's also been examples where bad guys have broken into the logistics and customs systems at a port. So, for example, I know that there is contraband information coming in on a container. Customs flags this container for additional examination. I know that customs is doing that, so I abandon the container. I never go claim it. And I just let it sit. Therefore, they have no linkage, back to me. Or I'm a bad guy and I come in with a bogus bill of lading for that container. I grab the container and it's off the port before the legitimate owner even know that it arrived. So all sorts of ways that this information can be used, obviously, by bad people.
By various people. Yeah, for sure. Now, in wrapping things up, when we were talking previously, you made a comment, and I want to raise it here to get your explanation of it. And your comment was, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, so just correct me if I was off base here. You're not a fan of the term cybersecurity. But you have good reason. We talked about that, and we agreed at the end of that conversation. So why don't you share that?
No, in fact, I don't. I mentioned, and I was careful to choose the word, that I've been in the information security business since the late 70s. So cybersecurity, to a certain degree, was a little bit of a made-up word. We've only been using this term for, I don't know, 15 years or so. And before that, we had all sorts of other terms. We had information security, computer security, network security, information assurance, and none of that is terribly sexy. But cybersecurity is. The reason I sort of cringe at the term is all too often we focus on cyberspace and we focus on the computers and the networks. Now, the computers, of course, store information. The networks are our conduits for information. And I feel, and I see this in conversation all the time, that people are losing focus on the fact that it's the information that I'm trying to protect.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, I can't protect the information if I'm not protecting the computers, the networks. I get that, but it's all too often it's not our focus, and I want to remind people that needs to be our focus.
Yeah, and When we talked about that, that's exactly what we both aligned and agreed on. It is about ultimately the information, right? It's there's all these different tiers you mentioned. We
Yep.
have to protect the network. We have to protect the applications. Yeah, we get it all. But ultimately, what are they after? The information set. So
Yeah.
for sure. Listen, Gary, truly a pleasure coming on and sharing a whole different angle on information security related to maritime. And again, we're going to include your book and links to your book within our show notes for those that would like to go and take a look at that. Definitely connect with Gary as well on this topic. And it's just been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
And I'd like to put in a plug also for the Maritime Hacking Village coming up at DEF CON in August. It is going to be a quite a wild ride.
I'm sure it will be. Thanks again for coming onto the
Thanks,
show.
Rob.
Appreciate it.
Hello, producer Ben here, and if you're a regular listener, you will know that this is where I point you towards another episode within the Reimagining Cyber catalogue, one that is in some way linked to what you've just heard. Well, bearing in mind that Rob and Gary have been talking about all things maritime, did you know that the Greek word for sailor is naut, and their word for star is astro, which means that the term astronaut quite literally means star sailor. And guess what? We have an episode all about the intersection of cybersecurity and space systems. It's episode 91 and it features space cybersecurity expert Tim Fowler.
One of the challenges that we have in space is the people that are working in space. They are some of the absolute brightest people on the face of the planet. They are intelligent. They think in ways that just will absolutely blow your mind. But they are hyper focused in their one area of expertise, their knowledge and experience. And that with that comes that hyper focus really does create tunnel vision, and where it leaves some gaps that vulnerabilities and stuff could exist and stuff.
That was Tim Fowler in episode 91 called Cybersecurity in Space, Securing the Final Frontier. Thanks for listening to Reimagining Cyber. To make sure you get the podcast every Wednesday as soon as it's released, then all you need to do is hit the follow button on whatever platform you use. Goodbye.